So, here we see that structuralism emerged in the mid-20th century as a movement that cuts across different disciplines. Its goal was to give the humanities, like literature and culture, a status similar to that of science. It challenges the idea that a literary work is simply a direct reflection of an author's personal self. Instead, it sees texts as constructs, things that can be analyzed objectively by uncovering their underlying mechanisms. The movement encourages us to look beyond just the obvious or surface-level meaning, and instead focus on the deep structures that make human practices and cultural products understandable. Think of it as trying to find the hidden frameworks that shape how we create and interpret meaning. By treating culture and literature as sign systems, structuralism aims to discover universal laws, rules that govern human expression across different contexts. This approach helps us see the bigger picture, revealing patterns that connect diverse cultural phenomena. Overall, the key idea is that by analyzing these structures, we can better understand how human communication and culture work at a fundamental level, which ties into the broader theme of deciphering meaning and systems in our world. Let's explore how structuralism's roots are connected to Russian formalism, especially through the work of Viktor Shklovsky. In 1917, he wrote an influential essay called Art as Device, which really laid the groundwork. Formalists believed that the main purpose of art is to make familiar objects seem unfamiliar. They called this process defamiliarization. This technique is about making us see things in a new way, forcing us to pay closer attention to the material qualities of language, like its sounds, structure, and form, rather than just what it means on the surface. The idea was to slow down perception and challenge our automatic understanding of everyday language and objects. Now, what's really interesting is how this approach reversed traditional views. Instead of prioritizing the content or the story itself, formalists focused on the formal devices, the techniques and structures used in art and literature. This shift set the stage for structuralism, which emphasizes internal relations, how elements within a system relate to each other, over external, outside realities. So, in essence, Russian formalism and the concept of defamiliarization helped us understand that the form of a work can be just as important as its content, shaping how we interpret and experience art and language. The linguistic turn was a major shift initiated by Ferdinand de Saussure, whose lectures were only published after his death as the course in General Linguistics in 1916. Saussure argued that linguistics should serve as a model for understanding all human culture and communication. He challenged the idea that language is just a collection of words that have accumulated over time to label things in the world. Instead, he saw language as a self-regulating system of signs. These signs are interconnected, and their meaning is determined by their relationships within the system. Saussure emphasized that language should be studied synchronically, meaning we look at it at a specific moment in time, rather than diachronically, which would be over historical development. This approach shifted how we understand language and its role in shaping human thought and culture, connecting directly to the broader theme of how language influences our perception of reality. Let's start by looking at Saussure's key distinction between langue and parole. Langue is the shared social system of rules and conventions that everyone within a language community agrees upon. It's like the underlying structure that exists before any individual speaks or writes. This system is what makes communication possible. It's the collective grammar and vocabulary we all learn. On the other hand, parole refers to the actual acts of speech or writing, those specific, intentional moments when we produce language in real-life situations. Every time you say a sentence or write a message, you're realizing the system of langue in a particular context. Now, in structuralism, the focus is primarily on langue, because it's seen as the foundation that allows for an infinite variety of utterances. The idea is that understanding the underlying grammar, the langue, gives us insight into how language functions overall. So, to connect this to the bigger picture, recognizing the difference between langue and parole helps us see how language is both a shared system and a set of individual acts. This distinction is crucial for understanding how meaning is constructed and how language operates as a structured yet flexible tool. Saussure redefined the linguistic unit as a sign, which is really like two sides of the same coin or two sides of a sheet of paper. One side is the signifier, which is the material form. Think of the sound image or the written marks we see and hear. The other side is the signified, which is the mental concept. That is, the idea or the meaning that this form evokes in our minds. What's really important here is that Saussure emphasized the connection between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary. There's no natural or inherent reason why, for example, the sound dog should refer to a four-legged animal. It's just a convention, a choice made within a language system. And because this connection is arbitrary, the meaning of a sign isn't fixed by nature, but is determined by its place within the whole system of language. Its value comes from how it differs from other signs around it, so it's all about relationships and differences within the system. This idea of the bipartite sign, with its two parts, signifier and signified, is fundamental to understanding how language functions as a system of differences, and it connects directly to the overall theme of how meaning is constructed and understood through signs. In language, there are really only differences without positive terms. That means a sign is defined by what it is not, rather than by some inherent meaning. For example, a word like cat only makes sense because it's distinct from words like bat, mat, or cap. These differences are what give the word its meaning within the linguistic network. What's important to understand is that meaning is relational and functional. It doesn't come from directly matching something in the real world, but rather from how signs interact with each other. The meaning arises from the relationships and distinctions between signs, not from their correspondence to objects. This insight is what led structuralists to the idea that meaning isn't something that exists inherently in objects themselves. Instead, meaning is produced by the systems we use to categorize and interpret those objects. So, in essence, difference and relationality are at the core of how language functions and how we derive meaning from it. Let's explore how Roman Jakobson expanded the structuralist theory by identifying 6 key elements that are involved in every act of communication. These elements are the addressor, the message, the addressee, the context, the contact, and the code. Each communicative act is influenced by one of these elements more than the others, which determines the dominant function at play. For example, when the focus is on the context or the real-world situation being referred to, we call that the referential function. On the other hand, when the emphasis is on the code itself, the language, symbols, or signs used, that's the metalinguistic function. This model helps us understand that communication isn't just about exchanging information. It's about how these elements interact and which one takes precedence, shaping the way messages are conveyed and understood. Overall, Jakobson's model highlights the complexity behind even the simplest exchanges and reminds us of the many layers involved in meaningful communication. Jakobson famously defined the poetic function as projecting the principle of equivalence from the axis of selection into the axis of combination. What this means is that, in everyday speech, we typically choose words from a sort of vertical list of similar options, like synonyms or related terms, and then we combine them horizontally to form sentences. But in poetry, something different happens. The qualities of the words we select, such as rhyme, rhythm, and sound, are emphasized and imposed on the way we arrange them. It's not just about meaning anymore, it's about how the words sound and how they feel when put together. This is what makes the poetic function so fascinating. It draws our attention to the sign itself, the words, the sounds, making the message an object of value in its own right. The focus shifts from just conveying information to creating an aesthetic or emotional effect through the choice and arrangement of words. So, in essence, the poetic function is about the deliberate selection of words and their combination, highlighting the artistic qualities of language itself. This approach makes the message stand out as a crafted object, not just a simple conveyance of meaning. Jakobson identified 2 fundamental ways of organizing discourse, metaphor and metonymy. Metaphor, as you may know, relies on similarity. It involves substituting one sign for another based on shared qualities, which is often visualized along a vertical axis of selection. For example, when we say passion is like a flame, we're creating a metaphor through resemblance. On the other hand, metonymy depends on contiguity, meaning physical or temporal proximity. It operates along a horizontal axis of combination, where one sign is associated with another through their relationship in space or time. A classic example is the crown to refer to the monarch. The crown is physically associated with royalty, so it's used metonymically. What's interesting is that Jacobson argued different genres tend to favor one of these modes. Romanticism, for instance, leans heavily on metaphor because it emphasizes emotional and imaginative expression. Conversely, realism tends to favor metonymy, reflecting a focus on concrete, connected details of the real world. So, understanding metaphor and metonymy as structural axes helps us see how language and discourse are organized. They shape how genres develop and how meaning is constructed, which ties into the overall theme of how communication works across different forms of expression. Claude Lévi-Strauss took Saussurian linguistics and applied it to anthropology, which means he looked at kinship and myths as systems of communication. He saw these elements not just as stories or social norms, but as structured systems similar to language. One of his key ideas was the concept of mythemes, which are minimal units of myth. Think of them like phonemes in language. They are the basic building blocks that combine to create meaning. Lévi-Strauss argued that myths shouldn't be viewed simply as chronological stories, but more as binary oppositions, like nature versus culture, that help resolve social contradictions. These oppositions reveal how societies organize their world and their values. He believed that these myth structures are universal. They reflect the fundamental operations of the human mind. So, despite cultural differences, there's a common way humans think and organize their myths and stories. This approach really connects to the overall theme of understanding cultural patterns through underlying structures. It's about seeing the deep, shared ways humans make sense of their world. So, here we see how early Roland Barthes took a very interesting approach by applying structuralist methods to everyday life. In his book Mythologies, published in 1957, he analyzed common cultural objects like wrestling, soap powder, and even steak and chips. He treated these objects as sign systems, which means he looked at how they carry hidden ideological messages beneath their surface. Now, for Barthes, the concept of myth is really key. He described myth as a second-order language. Essentially, this means that myth takes a sign that seems natural or obvious and transforms it into a vehicle that conveys bourgeois or middle-class values. His main goal was to demystify culture, showing us that what often appears as natural, or just the way things are, is actually a product of specific historical and cultural constructs. So, in this slide, we see how Barthes' approach helps us understand that our everyday cultural practices and objects are not just simple or neutral. They're embedded with deeper ideological meanings that shape our perceptions. Yuri Lotman, a Soviet semiotician, saw the poetic text as a system of systems. What this means is that every literary work is made up of multiple overlapping systems, like lexical, metrical, and graphic systems, and these can often create tension or even clash with each other. When we look at poetry, the meaning becomes overdetermined, which is a fancy way of saying it's shaped by many different formal structures acting at the same time on a single word. It's like layers of meaning competing and collaborating to give us a richer understanding. Lotman also introduced the idea of the minus device, which is really fascinating. It refers to the meaningful absence of something that we might expect based on the code. So, when a poem or text leaves out a device or element where we anticipate one, it actually adds to the meaning, creating a kind of tension or surprise. All of these ideas connect to our overall theme of understanding how meaning in literature and poetry isn't straightforward, but a complex interplay of systems and expectations. This perspective helps us see texts not just as isolated words, but as dynamic, layered structures full of potential for multiple interpretations. Structuralism revolutionized the way we study stories, giving rise to narratology, which aims to uncover the universal grammar that underlies all narratives. What this means is that instead of looking at stories as isolated works, narratologists try to identify the common rules and structures that make stories work across different cultures and genres. A key concept here is the distinction between fabula and sujet. Fabula is the raw, chronological sequence of events, the actual story in the order it happened. Sujet, on the other hand, is how that story is arranged aesthetically or stylistically, how it's told, the order in which events are presented to create meaning or suspense. This difference helps us understand how storytellers manipulate time and structure to shape our experience. The ultimate goal of this approach is to move beyond individual interpretation, so instead of each person having their own take, toward discovering a master code, a set of underlying rules that govern all storytelling. Think of it as trying to find the grammar that makes stories understandable and meaningful across different contexts. Interestingly, every narrative, according to this perspective, secretly reflects on its own construction. That is, stories are not just about the characters or events, but also about how they are put together. Their internal relations reveal insights into the storytelling process itself. So, in essence, narratology is like the science of stories. It seeks to decode the fundamental principles that underlie all narrative forms, helping us understand not just individual stories, but the very fabric of storytelling itself. Vladimir Propp analyzed Russian folktales to uncover their underlying structure. He identified 31 constant functions, which are essentially key actions that drive the story forward. These functions form the core of the narrative language, and what's fascinating is that despite the variety of stories, they all follow a similar logical sequence of these functions. Propp also introduced the idea of 7 spheres of action, or roles within the stories. These roles include the hero, the villain, the donor, and the helper, among others. What's really interesting about this model is that it shifts the focus from the psychological traits of characters to the structural roles they play in the story. This approach proved that the meaning of a narrative isn't just about what characters are like internally, but more about how they function within the story's structure. So, in essence, Propp's morphology of the folktale shows us that stories are built around a set of fundamental functions and roles, which helps us understand the universal patterns behind storytelling across cultures. Let's explore how A.J. Greima's refined Propp's work into a more universal framework. He introduced the actential model, which is built on 3 key pairs of binary oppositions. These pairs are subject and object, which relate to desire or motivation, sender and receiver, which deal with communication and the transfer of information, and helper and opponent, representing the forces that hinder or assist the main goal. Now, it's important to remember that an actant isn't a character in the traditional sense. Instead, it's a structural unit within the narrative system. This means that one character can fulfill multiple actant roles, depending on the situation. Greima's model offers us a powerful way to analyze complex stories more deeply. It helps us see how characters are positioned within the story's logic, revealing the underlying structure that drives the narrative forward. This approach really enhances our understanding of how stories function on a fundamental level. Tzvetan Todorov approached narrative analysis by proposing what he called a grammatical approach. Essentially, he treated characters as nouns and actions as verbs, which helps us see stories as structured language. The smallest meaningful unit in this system is what he called a proposition, which can be either an agent, like a character, or a predicate, which could be a static state or a dynamic action. He suggested that most stories follow a basic sequence, starting with an initial equilibrium, then a disturbance occurs that disrupts this balance, and finally, the story moves toward a new equilibrium. This pattern is fundamental because it captures the universal flow of many narratives across cultures and genres. Todorov's goal was to find a kind of universal syntax, a set of structural rules that could describe the core architecture of any story. This is part of the larger effort to understand storytelling as a kind of language with its own grammar, helping us analyze and compare stories systematically. So, in essence, Todorov's work pushes us to see stories not just as random sequences, but as structured systems with predictable patterns, something that ties into our overall exploration of narrative structure and meaning. Gerard Genette made some important refinements to narratology by breaking down the storytelling process into 3 distinct levels: histoire, récit, and narration. Essentially, he wanted to clarify how a story is constructed and told. One of his key focuses was on order, which looks at the relationship between the chronological order of events in the story and the order in which they are presented in the narrative. This is where concepts like analepsis, or flashback, and prolepsis, or anticipation, come into play, allowing us to see how authors manipulate time to create meaning or suspense. He also examined frequency, which is about how many times an event is retold, and duration, which deals with the speed or packing of the storytelling, how quickly or slowly the narrative unfolds. These tools give us a systematic way to analyze individual works, considering each as a unique expression of parole, or the act of speech. Overall, Genette's work offers us a rigorous framework to understand the intricacies of narrative structure and how time functions within storytelling. It's a valuable approach because it helps us see each story as a carefully crafted system, not just a simple sequence of events. Let's take a closer look at Gerard Genette's most innovative contribution to narrative theory. What really sets him apart is his distinction between mode, which asks who sees, and voice, which asks who tells. This differentiation is crucial because it allows us to understand different aspects of perspective within a story. When we talk about mode, or focalization, we're referring to the perspective from which the story is presented. This can be internal, meaning we see through a character's eyes; external, where the story is observed from outside; or zero focalization, which presents a more neutral or omniscient viewpoint. On the other hand, voice concerns the narrative instance, so the act of narrating itself. It's about who is telling the story and what their relationship is to the narrative. This distinction helps clarify questions about narrative authority, who has the right to tell the story, and how that influences our understanding. By separating mode and voice, Genette gave us a much more precise way to analyze the point of view in storytelling. It helps us see how different narrative choices shape our experience and perception of the story. So, in summary, this distinction between focalization and voice really enriches our understanding of narrative structure, making it clearer how stories are constructed and who is telling them at any given moment. Jonathan Culler argued that the goal of structuralist poetics isn't really to interpret works in the traditional sense, but rather to understand how interpretation itself is formed. He introduced the idea of literary competence, which is essentially the implicit knowledge that readers carry with them. This knowledge allows us to make sense of texts without needing explicit instructions. What's really interesting is that readers don't simply find meaning out in the text. Instead, they produce it. They do this by following internalized conventions, like expecting a story to have unity or thematic coherence. These conventions are part of our unconscious rules for making sense of literature. So, in a way, structuralism becomes an investigation into these categories of sense-making, these mental frameworks, that we use to interpret not just texts, but the world around us. It shifts the focus from individual meaning to the underlying systems that guide how we understand everything. This connects to the overall theme of the presentation by highlighting how our interpretation is shaped by these internalized systems, which structuralism aims to analyze and understand. So, as Roland Barthes famously argued with his concept of the death of the author, the idea is that a text is really more like a tissue of quotations than a wholly original creation. What this means is that meaning isn't something fixed or dictated solely by the author's intent. Instead, it becomes centered in the reader, who actively reassembles the codes embedded within the text. This shift highlights that the individual, the reader, is no longer seen as the sole origin of meaning. Instead, we're viewed as products of the structures and systems we inhabit. Our understanding is shaped by these external frameworks, which decenter the individual from being the ultimate authority over interpretation. All of this ties into the internal contradictions and instability of signs that structuralists identified. These tensions and complexities pave the way for post-structuralism, which questions the idea of fixed meanings even further. So, in essence, the move to post-structuralism represents a recognition that meaning is fluid, unstable, and constructed through the interplay of codes, contexts, and reader engagement, challenging the traditional notions of authorship and fixed significance.